session. It's called Creating Engaging and Inclusive News for Your Intranet. And, before we get started, we'd like to encourage you to please, help drive the event awareness and tweet and post. Make sure you don't take embarrassing pictures of me when I've got my mouth open. But other than that, feel free to take snapshots and tweet about it, especially if you see interesting slides that you want to share with the audience. And I would like to introduce you to my co-presenter, but really, I mean, she's the main presenter of the event. Emily is one of the few people who's a member of the Patterns and Practices team, an MVP, and she's also I'm trying to remember the master, that's right, it's a master at Nielsen Norman Group. And if you know about the Nielsen Norman Group, there are a bunch of amazing people who do research around user experience, user interfaces, and how to really design content for actual human. So with that, let me introduce you to Emily.
And we've got Hugo joining me today. He's a senior cloud solution architect at Microsoft and often goes by the world's laziest developer. But I think that's just because he loves participating in the community, using community resources, helping raise those community voices, and is one of my colleagues on the Sharing is Caring team. So if you are not familiar with that, we are a group that tries to lower the barriers for entry to participate in the community. So highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more about that, to check us out. And Hugo will drop that link into the chat.
I will now, I
Thanks,
guess.
Hugo. Appreciate it. I think you have it memorized more than me.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be going over a couple of different things. We're going to first start off with talking about leveraging SharePoint News. Then we're going to talk about conveying your message and getting the results you want. So I'd say this presentation is 50% what you can do in SharePoint, and then also 50% user experience best practices to make sure that you're surfacing your news and really driving that engagement that you want in your organization. So let's start off with leveraging SharePoint News. The average office worker receives about 121 emails a day, and some studies say that we get more than 200. Out of all of these emails, about 87 are relevant to us. And some studies, in 2019, Adobe did a study, said that it took an average of 5 hours and 52 minutes per day to sort through their email. That's an enormous amount of time. Now, most company news is sent via email, but so is everything else. All of those ads you didn't sign up for that you're inevitably getting, some action items that you're getting from your colleagues, maybe some questions that were misdirected, in addition to this news. The volume of email isn't really the only thing challenging us. Hugo's going to walk through some of the other challenges of why sending your company news through email is not the best approach.
So, the first challenge with sending emails to send your news is that you're not building organizational memory. Think about the new people who are joining today or tomorrow. They don't get to get all the amazing email news that you've sent, the last week or the week before or even today. And that's one of the challenges, right? You want to make sure that when new people join your organization, that they get every opportunity to catch up because they're eager, they're excited, they want to know more. And that's the best time to capture their attention. So by creating news that are, that resides in places like SharePoint and things like that, you're actually building that organizational memory that you're allowing people to learn more about the organization. Just remember that. Now, the other thing about sending emails is that, again, we're bombarded with email. So you get less engagement. Right? And it's really difficult also to even, and we'll talk about that later, but it's really difficult to measure that engagement. Like, how do I know? Yes, I can tell that people received the email. I might even get a read receipt from the email, but I don't know if people actually read the email or if they clicked through that email. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about is measuring that engagement, making sure that people really get excited about those news and that we are targeting the news to the people that really need it. Now, we know that emails are also the cause of many distractions. And, we don't need more distractions right now. We just need less distractions. And if you think about like I mean, we're talking about multitasking here, right? Like multitasking, people think that multitasking, involves different types of resources. Like, I've got this Outlook, I've got Teams, I got things like that, and we think that we're good at multitasking. But multitasking is truly serial task switching, and task switching increases stress. In fact, frequent multitaskers will take half a second longer than light multitaskers to refocus their attention. And in average, an email will take about 45 seconds of distraction just by receiving the email. And so we want to make sure that people are really able to focus on that message, because we'll talk about what the point of these news and these messages are all about. Now, we talked about the fact that you don't get really analysis on emails that are being sent because, again, all you get is a read receipt, maybe, but that's only if I allow you to get a read receipt on the email. But what about understanding? Well, did people actually click through that email and open that announcement? Did people read the announcement? Did people spend time on that page? You're not getting any of that with emails. And that's one of the things that we can take advantage of with SharePoint News. Search capacity. If you think about it, right, we've talked about the fact that as a new person, I joined the organization. I don't get all that historical news because I didn't have an email address before I joined the organization. But also, where I get to find my news is only within the context of my own emails. And, if you work in an organization that has a tendency to say, hey, you've got way too many emails right now, we're going to need to get rid of stuff. How do you get the benefit of being able to go back to all those old news and things like that? And so by moving those news to a different platform where we're not making multiple copies of that email or that news, we're actually having a single copy, which is the authoritative source. People learn that, oh, well, wait a minute, to go to my SharePoint environment is the place where I'll get the authoritative and accurate source of information. I should probably pick a better word to say than that because it's a hard word to say. And I always talk about in IT, there's a measure of time called an onosecond. And an onosecond is the amount of time between when you hit enter and you realize you made a mistake, where you go, oh no, I shouldn't have sent this. So when you send an email, you have no ability to undo or redo. You pretty much, have to. And if you've ever tried to recall because you sent something embarrassing, recall is probably the best way to bring attention to the fact that you sent something embarrassing. Because people go, oh, well, this person wants to recall. I better go look at why they want to recall it. But if you actually send, even if you send an email to a message in the news that's stored in SharePoint, and you made a mistake, you can go fix that message in SharePoint, even maybe after the first person reported the error, and that's really important. All right, and I think Emily's cueing me here that I need to move forward faster.
Sorry, Hugo.
That's okay. There's also no integration with Microsoft 365. So again, the value of using Microsoft 365 is that brilliant ecosystem that we have, right? It's not each individual thing like Outlook and SharePoint and Teams and all these things being independent. It's the beauty of having that thank you, the auctioneer mode. Okay, I'm going to talk faster now. The no integration with Microsoft 365 is important because again, it's part of that huge ecosystem, and we want to make sure that people are able to access the news the way they want to access them using the tools that they're most comfortable with, and that's something Emily will talk about later.
So SharePoint News supports the ability to curate your internal news, but also link to the external news sources. So you're able to bring all of the information you want to share internally to the organization, but also embed anything that you're sharing out, for example, on your LinkedIn, your external website, your press releases. Even better, you can create news digests for both of these types of news. So you're creating one place for your company to go for all of the news they need, regardless of the source. They no longer have to go to multiple websites, their email, the intranet, and external websites to be fully up to date on what's going on in your organization. Now, in the modern intranet world, we have decentralized content and the world is flat and we all have these separate site collections. But this is a lot different than the typical content model for how people are gathering their information to share their news. What we can see on the screen right now in this structure is very often all the different departments are feeding their news up through corporate communications. They're gathering it, they're reviewing it, then they're sharing it out. One of the benefits of decentralizing your news is it actually ensures the freshest content updates are being shared immediately across the organization without that delay of going through a centralized review and posting process. Very often, organizations where I worked, it actually caused issues when we were trying to create the newsletter because some of those articles were already so old by the time the newsletter came out, it was no longer relevant. So, this is a pretty big inherent shift in how companies are prepared to share their news. So this model right now shows the roll-up of news without that centralized review process. We'll talk a little bit more later about creating governance. So I'm not recommending go wild with your news. There's definitely some checks and balances you can have in place so you can create a consistent user experience across all of your different news posts in your environment. Now, one of the things to consider is that the value of your news increases with the number of sources contributing content. So, Metcalfe's law states the number of a network is equal to the number of nodes squared. So, the more connections you have, the greater the value of that network. I'm sure that's something we've all learned through networking on LinkedIn, for example. I remember when me and my one friend had a cell phone and it wasn't super useful because we still had to navigate the cultural world where you called someone up ahead of time, you planned ahead, and then you were all going to meet at a designated time. There was none of this last minute, I'm running late, I'm going to cancel, I can't make it. But now that everyone has a cell phone, it's an absolute core communication device and it's changed the culture of how we communicate with each other. So, as you increase the number of groups in your organization sharing news with SharePoint, it's going to become even more valuable. Your intranet news suddenly becomes that central source for all news instead of that combination of SharePoint, email, and the external website that we keep discussing. Now, we've given you some reasons why you should use SharePoint News, but I think what's really important is understanding how easy it is. So let's just take a quick look at creating a very simple news post. Today, we are working at a travel company and we are going to be posting news about all the different excursions that were going on now that the world is returning back to travel. So from the news web part, you can select Add News. You can select a page template. And then as you add your title of the page, that's also going to be the title of your news article. You can also change that author where it says my name below, so you can ghostwrite on behalf of other people. You can add in a banner image, so you can pick something to really put your news story in context and have a visual aid to really kick off what you're talking about. And then in this example, we're just pasting in some text. It's a very simple news post. And there we go. In under 30 seconds, we have a news post in our intranet, and we have separated out our dynamic content from our static content. At the end of the day, the aesthetic usability principle cites that users often perceive aesthetically pleasing design as design that's more usable. I've seen a lot of very ugly email news because you don't have a lot of capability in Outlook unless you're using something like MailChimp or all these other solutions to really make a rich canvas. You have SharePoint at your fingertips, and you can do that now all out of the box without having to learn any code. And if you're already building SharePoint pages for your intranet, it's a technology that you're actually really familiar with as well. So there's no new learning curve. Now, what I just mentioned was separating out your dynamic content from your static content. So think about your intranet. You might have all of your pages the exact same way right now, and you're not separating them out at all. So you might have a piece of news, for example, these COVID-19 travel restrictions. This is dynamic content because hopefully these travel restrictions are going to continue to be changing. They're not always going to be there. So you can actually take a SharePoint page and transition that into a SharePoint news page. So you can see here on the top navigation, we select promote and then post as news on site. There we go. My static page is now part of my dynamic content, automatically feeding into my news web part on one of my SharePoint sites. Now, I promised you can also bring external content that your company is sharing into your intranet as well. So let's take a look at how we do that. What we use is called a news link. So we grab the URL and paste it in, and it's really pretty smart. It'll typically grab the image, the title, and the description right from the article. But here, I'm going to edit it a little bit because I want to put it in context at my organization, why it matters to them. So you can change the title, and I'm going to put a little bit more details here because it's specifically about an April COVID update from the CDC. And then in the description, you can also change this teaser text to talk about why it's relevant to your organization. And I see I just got a question in the chat. Is it possible to re-promote an item over time to ensure updates are seen? There's a couple different ways to do this. One of the ways that you could do it is to use Boost News, which I'm going to show you in a couple slides. Another way to do it is you can manually organize your news. So you can go to the Webpart settings, click edit, and then put them in a specific order. I'm trying to think of if you could, if you edit your page and hit publish, it's not going to change the order that it appears in the news web part. So my recommendation would be one of those two. Do you have anything else you would add to that, Hugo?
No, I think it's, and we'll talk about a bit later how you got to be careful because news can start being interpreted as banner ads at some point, right? And so you might have the reverse effect that you're looking for. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I think your question is a very important point. Thank you for asking.
And then we have another question from Beth. Is it possible to automatically feed news into your intranet from your public facing website? Out of the box, there's no automatic way to do that. There's no integration like an RSS feed. And I will be the first to say anything that's not out of the box is not my specialty. So I'll let Hugo speak to if he knows of anything where maybe you could consider using something like Microsoft Flow. I'm not sure.
Yeah. In fact, with using Power Automate, you can absolutely do things like subscribe to an RSS feed. You can also, depending on the technology you're using for your website, you can even create webhooks, right? So when your content changes on your site, it actually calls a Power Automate workflow that will actually go get the latest content, or at least get the metadata about the content, so that we're not duplicating the content, we're just providing links to it. And I've even seen organizations that will use LinkedIn, for example, as their kind of official news mechanism, and they'll actually point people to LinkedIn. The If you're using LinkedIn, there is a little bit of challenge because LinkedIn really tries to discourage people from just going to automatically scan their content from their website, because it's all about encouraging engagement and things like that. So if you have something like this, you would probably want to create some kind of subscription mechanism where you'd say, go send an email to this email address when new content is created, and then trigger a process to actually do this. You could manually do stuff, but again, I think the whole point here is we're trying to um, make it sustainable, right? To gather content from other places. So any opportunity you have to automatically trigger the process would be the best thing to do.
And then one more question before we move on to our next section. With SharePoint Online, there's only one page library per site. Do you use metadata to differentiate news pages versus navigation pages? I'm actually going to just pull up onto the screen my dev tenant and show you what is there. So in the site pages library, SharePoint's actually automatically adding that metadata for you. It's called the promoted state. So let's go there, and I'll show you one quick little trick while we're in the site pages library. So here we have the promoted state. And what I love to do, you can't do it from the classic view settings, but you can do it from this view right here, where you can actually group by promoted state. Whoops, I had it grouped and I just undid it. Unassigned is where SharePoint automatically puts your templates folder. 0 is those static pages. This is not news. 1 is a news post that's in draft that's not yet published. And 2 is a published news story. And then what about sharing news to LinkedIn, assuming content can be shared externally? I think that's a trickier question because in general, SharePoint Online isn't necessarily set up to be promoting external content and open to everybody. So I wouldn't recommend that approach.
And I would agree with you. Awesome. So let's talk about, because we're talking about SharePoint News, right? And you might say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not going to get my users to go to SharePoint all the time. But that's the beauty of SharePoint News, right? SharePoint News will reach your employees where they are because the news that we show on the SharePoint page, right, they're also the same news that are available in the mobile app. They're available in Teams, especially if you like add the connectors. You can actually even promote these news in other places. You can add it to team sites, you can add it to communication sites, you can add it to hub sites where it rolls up the news from the different sites within that environment. And that you can drop the news web part as well. And the news web part can be configured to surface really only the news from that site or a filtered view of that site's news, or include news from like all the other sites, including like a roll-up of all the sites that are part of that hub. So you got a lot of flexibility here, and we'll definitely talk about there's even more. So but wait, if you order now, you also get more. So the first thing we can talk about is how to send the news through an email. So you click on send the email, or share it and send the email. And then you can send the post by email. And as Emily showed earlier, right, the one thing that it's always very good at is it understands the context of that news. It'll grab the picture that represents that news, and it'll grab the title as well as the lead, right? And we'll talk about the lead a little bit later, but um, using news as a way to send email, and you'll say, well, wait a minute, you told us don't use email. But again, think about it. No, what we're doing is we're not making a copy of that news. We're actually sending people a link to that news. And right away, we're able to start leveraging, well, hey, I can see how many people actually clicked on that email because they went to the SharePoint page. And I can even, and we'll talk about later about the analysis, but that's that little change in behavior that still allows people to who want to get their emails for news, they still get their email for news. But we're changing the behavior gradually. We also have the Sharepoint App Bar, right? And this is has been relatively new over the last little while, but the ability to actually get the news directly from that app bar on the left side that allows me to see the news. And again, this is my news. So these are the news that are important to me. They'll include the corporate news or the official, news that I want to have, as well as the news from the other sites that are relevant to me. And we'll talk later about information overload. This is something that we're trying to avoid. Is we're trying to avoid, if you work in a company that has multiple head office all over the world, you probably don't want to get the news about the cafeteria menu in Toronto if you live in London. And so making sure that the news that we're getting are really targeted to the people who need those news through the SharePoint App Bar is really important. The news web part that I talked about here is something that, again, you've seen it before because it's the out-of-the-box web part, but you can actually use that web part yourself, and you can configure. And I think little bit later we'll show you how to do that. The SharePoint start page is, and some people actually, don't even know about that page, but the SharePoint start page is actually a page that will roll up all the sites that you belong to in one place, and it'll actually start triaging or prioritizing, I guess is a better word to say, the sites that you use. But the other thing that it does, it will look at all the news from all the sites that you belong to, and it will bring them at the top. And again, we'll talk about the Gutenberg grading gravity and some layout rules. So that's one of the best ways to actually make sure that everyone stays up to date with everything that's going on through the sites. And one thing we're trying to avoid here is We don't want to have our users to say, well, okay, now I need you to go to the HR site and the IT site and the corporate site to get all the news. We'll just roll them up for you in one place. The mobile app, if you haven't used the mobile app, it's constantly getting better and better. And one of the things that we have now is the ability to send push notifications from the sites that you follow, right? So again, if I belong to the steering committee for the social committee or whatever, and I get some important news from there, I can actually get these news being pushed to me when they're important, and that includes things like the official corporate news or HR news or things like that.
And it's great for frontline workers too.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. That's a very good point. And teams, right? If you live in teams, and we're starting to see more and more people living and like not ever leaving team, uh, that's a great way because you can actually use a connector to change. Like if you want to actually customize the behavior, you can use a connector to actually get the news to go in directly into Teams. I use that within my teams at Microsoft. And I know it sounds really weird. Well, Microsoft people are using Teams. Yes, we do. But we use actually the news and the connectors to actually stay up to date within our individual teams. And that's really important. And send to Yammer. So the ability for actually to post this news, again, the news is in SharePoint. We're not making a copy of that news. We're actually we're creating new channels, if you will, to bring people into this news. So we'll go to Yammer, and just like we did with an email, we'll actually, usually tell people why they should care about this news in the context of Yammer, and we'll have a title, a picture, and a description. And again, we're going to be able to track the interaction and the usage because people will be clicking on that email in that Yammer posting to go into the news. Viva Connections. I hope you're playing with Viva Connections, but Viva Connections is kind of like that reimagined SharePoint experience that is now really curated for Microsoft Teams. And so within Viva Connections, now we're able to create some dashboards or adaptive card extensions that are able to really bring all the information that I need as a as a worker to actually do my job. And one of the things that we can do is we can bring the news into Viva Connections as well. Now, we talked about information overload and reaching the right audience. The one thing that we want to make sure is that, again, if we're just constantly bombarding news to people who don't care about a particular topic, again, I talked about the cafeteria menu in Toronto for people in London, they don't care about that. So how do I make sure that people get the news that are relevant to them? Well, one of the things you can do is to use audience targeting. And let's show you how you can do that. So the first thing that you do is you go to the page details. And in the page details here, you'll have the ability to actually um, detect the audience here, and you'll set the properties, right? So what we'll do here is we'll actually go and we'll add, now I can add groups, SharePoint groups that belong to that audience. I can't really target to an individual person. But now the cool thing about that is when I go to a page or I go to and we'll leverage the page audience targeting in the web parts later. But the fact that it knows that this particular piece of news in this page is really intended for these people. Now, think about some of the cool audiences that you could create. For example, new employees, right? So maybe we want to create a SharePoint group that anybody that has joined the company within the last year, they belong to this group, or managers, or people who work in the Toronto office. And that's one of the ways that we can take advantage of this. Now, if we go to the next little tidbit here.
So you can also filter your news, which Hugo mentioned when he was talking about where SharePoint can reach everybody, and you can actually filter in the web part. And Benjamin spotted in my demo, I had a site column called news category, which I created. So if I wanted to have a limit, and you can see that right here on the screen, if you want to have a limit of what is showing in the web part, you can create any type of site column you want, any values in that choice dropdown and then tag them to a page and filter it in that web part. Now, I've also seen this used at organizations who want to use audience targeting, but aren't fully there yet with their Active Directory data. So they actually created a site, tagged the organization in it, and then filtered by that organization. So it could be a temporary workaround while you're working on your Active Directory data. But let's take a look at how we do this. So the first couple steps I skipped over because you're all SharePoint champions. You know how to make site columns. So magic passing of time, we have this site column in our site library already. And we're just going to start off with going to the information panel, and we're going to select COVID-19 update for these 2 pages. Now, if I click on the edit button in my news web part, I can go to the page properties, and then I can type in news category, and I can choose just those COVID-19 updates. And you'll see that web part is live updating. So we see those 2 pages we just tagged to COVID-19 update. Now, if we change it to all staff, instantaneously, we have different news stories there filtered. So you can use this even across site collections. You'll need to make sure your site column is a managed property, and you can use this news web part to filter by managed properties as well. Now, earlier, I talked a lot about publishing news and not necessarily going through corporate communications. Well, for any of my corporate communications friends on the call, don't worry, you're still incredibly important and we absolutely need you. And there's definitely value in that authoritative news in your organization. What you can do with one line of PowerShell is tag any site collection. And I believe you can do this up to 250, which seems a little bit aggressive. I would keep it a low number so people treat it separately. But what you essentially get is this little box and this visual signifier that this is authoritative news. And it's a little bit different than the rest of the news we can see in that web part for Sayulita, Mexico City, and Key West. Those are not considered organization news. Now, another thing that you can do, and I referenced this earlier when people were asking about, can we bring the news further up in our news web part? And if we are changing the news, how do I keep that as a top story? You can do what's called boost news to raise visibility. So after you publish your news post, you'll see on the top navigation bar, we have this little lightning bolt for boost. And what you can do is click on that, turn boost on, and you can pick a date until it is boosted. And you can do this up to 5 news stories because that's how many fit in the web part, and you can change the order. In this example, there's just the one. So once that date passes, it automatically sorts back into the chronological order of the news posts. I mentioned that you could do this in the news web part manually as well. The challenge with doing it manually is you then have to set yourself a calendar reminder on that date to then unpin that news from your news web part. Now, a couple of years ago, I believe it was 2019 at Microsoft Ignite, they also promised boost news until it was read and boost news until a certain percentage of the organization has seen it. At the Microsoft 365 conference in Las Vegas, I asked about both of these and I haven't gotten the answer yet, but I heard that Boost News until it is read is live at Microsoft. So we're hoping that it comes to our tenants soon. Nothing on the roadmap right now, but I absolutely promise to tweet a whole ton about it if I hear any updates. Now, a couple of other things that we've been talking about is bringing all these news posts across site collections, your external news, which are news links, into one digestible format to send out to your organization. So you have a one-stop shop to check that news. And that's what's called a news digest. So you can highlight some of this key information that your employees may have missed during the week. Maybe this is a sub-selection of news posts that you really want to highlight and make sure everybody has read. So let's take a peek at how we build one of those. Now, the first thing is you have to have at least 4 stories before that see all button appears in the top right. So if you have a site with 1 to 3 stories, you're not going to be able to send a news digest yet. So just know that fact. But now that we have our 4 stories, we're going to click see all. And we can select email and news digest and then select any of the stories. It can be non-continuous. You don't have to select ones that are next to each other. So I'm just going to grab a couple of random ones on this page and hit next. And now we're building actually a SharePoint page. So the name of your news digest is going to be the name of your SharePoint page in the long term. Again, you can send this to anyone in your organization, any kind of email distribution list, and you can actually reorder these stories. Once you hit send, it goes to someone in their inbox. And again, you have that SharePoint page on the back end as well. So if you have a new employee who wasn't emailed the news digest, they can look retroactively in time and see what the organization considered that top news previously before they joined. Now, a couple of tips when you're creating these news digests. They're kind of like a replacement for what we consider a newsletter in the organization right now. The average time spent on a newsletter is only 51 seconds, and participants really only read 19% of it. So, a couple of tips to make sure that you're really hitting your target market. Make sure that they're informative, that they're keeping your end users up to date. This has been mentioned by 2/3 of internet users, so even outside of just the intranet, that the newsletters they read because it has some kind of actionable item for them that they need to know. You want to make sure it's convenient. So again, us delivering it to their inbox where they're working every day, super easy for them to access. And then lastly, you want to make sure it's timely. So earlier in this presentation, I talked about that centralized curation of news, how that sometimes slows it down and information gets stale. You really want to make sure this is timely and it's offering current information and real-time delivery. So if you're going to use the news digest, do try to do them with that fresh content as it's being released. Now, this is what it looks like when you get it in your inbox. The top thing that I get as a comment is, well, this doesn't look like my newsletter. This looks like a Microsoft SharePoint newsletter. That's fair feedback. And I look forward to Microsoft giving us more branding options on this in the future. But for right now, a great workaround, send it to yourself. It's just a table with JPEGs. Delete out all the Microsoft branding, put in your own company branding, and make it feel more relevant to your organization. 67% of people don't read that intro text at a newsletter. So here you can see I have very bad intro text. Hello, travel fans. Check out the latest updates from this past week. No one cares. No one's really going to read it. If I'm going to put something in there, make sure it's actionable and relevant to your organization. Now, you can also get automatic news digests, and they're sent out once per week with a maximum of 10 news posts. How does it know what to send? Well, when your direct management chain publishes a news post, that'll be in it. When a worker close to you publishes a news post, that will be in it. When it is a news post from a site where you clicked that star in the top right corner to follow, that will be in it as well. And then if it's any of those organizational news sites or boosted news, as we can see on the screen right here, those will also be included. Now, Microsoft did give us really good branding options on this one. You can brand your logo image, the navigation bar color, the text icon color, and accent color. So this is a great opportunity to make this auto news digest look and feel like something your organization is releasing.
Awesome. Thank you. Emily, I love all these stats. I don't know if you know this, but 82% of statistics are made up on the spot, by the way. um, all right. So we've talked about how we can, get the news to people in the way that they need it. We've talked about how we can target news, but what about when I'm the creator of these news? And I want to make sure that maybe I'm collaborating with people within my organization because I want them to review these news before they become available to everybody else. And so one of the things that's not available yet, but I've heard that if you wait until maybe like around April 21st or so, that's the latest rumor, you're going to get something called private drafts on SharePoint pages and news. So that's the ability to actually for you to create news and to make private drafts only visible to the page author, the people that the author chooses to share the news with, and with the cited bins. And it's again great for editing, approving content, making sure that the content is ready for others to see. And then when we publish the news, they will become available. And how do you do that, you might ask? Well, there you go. There's a little checkbox here. It's not really obvious, but it allows you to, when you create a page, you can say create it as a private draft. And that wording might change, but it'll be something to that effect. Now, we've talked about getting people to leverage SharePoint news and targeting the news to people and things like that. But let's talk about conveying your message because that's really what this is all about, right? So why don't we talk about what is to communicate? I've once been told by a very wise person that to communicate is to convey a message that results in a change in behavior. And that's this huge impact here is like we want a change in behavior. If we don't get a change in behavior, we're just making noise. And we kind of want to. So if we say, hey, please, everybody, go do your timesheets on time, right? That's the desired change in behavior. So then how are we going to craft a message that will get people to adopt that change in behavior? And so one of the things that we want everyone to understand is when people talk about news, they're like, oh, my employees can't wait to come into work and to just they want to grab the morning coffee and they want to read my news. You're completely mistaken. That's really not how it works. And you might say, oh well, it's their job, right? It's their responsibility to stay up to their news. You know, they have better things to do. I mean, the communication people, they that might be their job and they might be super focused on news, but unfortunately, and this is not people being malicious, they have better things to do. They have their jobs to do, right? And again, you might say, well, they should read my company news, but it's not. And research shows that first of all, people don't read on computer screens the same way that they read on paper. And it's important to understand that. In fact, the sooner you recognize that, the sooner you can correct that behavior from your users by adapting your page structure to break unhealthy reading patterns. And in fact, and this is not a made up stat, I probably shouldn't have joked about that. In fact, you can actually get 124% better usability by just changing your page structure. And let's talk about that. So, the first thing that we want to make sure is that when we identify, the message we're trying to communicate, we want to find who's going to read that news. Who's this intended for? And then we want to understand what are their goals, right? So, thank you. I'm going to need some stats source. What are their goals? What are the readers' goals, right? When they're reading that news, because you want to understand what's in it for them. And you want to make sure that you understand what is the impact that you want your content to have on the reader. Because again, if there's no incentive for them, like here we have like ask questions and you get a chance to win $25. There's an incentive there. There's something in it for you. And so what is the equivalent of that? And we don't want to be giving $25 for everyone who reads news in the organization, right? So how am I going to do this? Well, your page structure really affects how people read the news or don't. And there's lots of amazing studies that have been done around that. Let's take a look. So the first thing is, when people don't look at things like subheadings and bullets, they tend to like fixate on the words that are towards the beginning of the lines and towards the top of the page. So what you're seeing here, by the way, it's kind of a cool study that's been done by Nielsen Norman, where they actually put infrared cameras pointing towards people's eyes, and they actually shot infrared lights into people's eyes, and then they kind of monitored where people were looking on a page. And they found a scanning behavior. When people read pages, they look at kind of an F-shaped pattern, and you see that highlighted here. And so that's kind of like, and that's the name of the behavior is F-shaped reading pattern. In left to right patterns or languages, sorry, the text that's on the left and towards the top of the page is usually read more than the text on the right and towards the bottom of the page. And this is something that is called the reading gravity, or some people call it the Gutenberg rule. And so people tend to minimize the interaction cost and maximize the benefit they get from the work that they do. So like for their eyes, like this translates into like spending, like when we talk about fixations or things where we stop and look at. So we spend as few fixations as possible. We're still trying to kind of get the information that we need. And we want to be productive and we want to be engaged and we want to be successful. And what we take from those fixations, like the times that we stop and look at things, we're trying to economize on the time that we spend on these things. So that means we'll look at fewer words, right? In some cases, like people will get bored and fatigued, and they 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 won't scan the text. So um, now other times people will actually the words that they read, they'll offer something called a weak information set. And this is something that Emily does a great job at explaining. She'll do that later for us. But it means that, like, I might look at the content and I might not get enough gratification from that content. And so I might actually give up on scanning. And this is what we see, like in the shaping, the F-shaped pattern that we see here. It's people kind of giving up. You see that there's full, I'm sorry, there's full sentences here. And people are not looking at the right side of the page, right? So when people scan in an F shape, they miss big chunks of content merely based on how the text flows and the columns. See how we're going and looking around, and you'll also notice that the text fix the eye fixations towards the right, like the ads and things like that. People don't look at that, and even if it's internal content, people won't look at those things because again we've been trained to avoid ads, and you'll also notice that at the bottom of the page we barely look at that content. So if you understand that, you can actually structure your content to help people.
So, what people are doing, they're not scanning these pages because they're lazy. They're scanning because it's more efficient, right? So, people are reading approximately 28% of what is on the screen. And this type of information gathering is called satisficing, one of my favorite words. So it's this idea that people will look on the page until they find an answer that's adequate for the information they need. Not necessarily the best answer, just the minimum viable answer for them to move forward. So how do they know which path to go down or where they're most likely to find this key information they need when they're reading on the web? As Hugo's been mentioning and alluding to, writing for the web is a lot different. People are scanning and moving quickly. So, our recommendation is that you write in an inverted pyramid. This ensures that the most critical point of information is at the top of the page in an overview. So, if someone's only reading 28% of your page, they're only on it for a matter of seconds, they're going to have a really good understanding of what information is going to be on the page and in this article. Then as you continue down the page, you'll want to have progressive disclosure and get into more detail. So you're at the absolute most refined bit of detail at the bottom of the page. So let's talk about the different tips for how you can start writing in this inverted pyramid. First, you want to identify your key points. I recommend putting this into that 1 to 2 sentence overview to start the page. And let's actually look at how we would put it into our SharePoint news page. So here at our travel company, again, Disney's reopening, what do people need to know? I recommend adding a new section at the top of the page and putting in your overview. Now, when you put in this information, put in the word overview and use the header styles heading 1. You should only have one heading 1 per page, and using these headings supports people who are using screen readers. And then I added in a little light gray background to separate this overview out physically from the rest of the page. So it's drawing my eyes to this section of information, and I can know this is a little bit different. After I've added that overview, now you want to rank your secondary information. These should be the subsequent paragraphs that you have and use clear headers. So you want to make sure that you're using these correct header styles to show the relationships. So we just used heading 1 for overview. And as I mentioned, you only want to use that once. So now when I'm going back into the page and I scroll down and I want to reference limited capacity at the park, the next header style I should use is heading 2. And because group size is related to the limited capacity at the park, I'm going to use heading 3 to show that they are connected. When I go down to steps to visit Disneyland, that's a whole new section. It's totally okay for me to go back up to heading 2. Now, you also want to make sure that you're writing well and concisely. So there's a couple different tools that you can use to help support this. One of my favorites is the Hemingway app. This is an online tool that you can use. It helps you identify passive voice, the reading grade level, and run-on sentences. As I mentioned with the newsletters, you're going to want to skip that flowery first paragraph. We made an actionable overview of what it means to the reader, why it's important to them, and what this page is going to talk about. In your subsequent paragraphs, the ideal length is actually 20 words per sentence and 5 sentences per paragraph. This came from usability.gov. And remember that when you're writing these pages, these can all be found via search. So you want to define all acronyms once per page. You want to make sure that if someone lands on this page out of context, they can fully understand what's on it. Remove any kind of jargon and idioms, and you want to make sure that you're making it clear, direct, and very, very succinct. Now, why do we need it to be so succinct? Nielsen Norman Group did a study of how many words per page people read. On an average visit, users read half the information on pages with 111 words or less. That's incredibly short. The average page has 593 words. So they're, again, reading 28% of it, which is that stat that we referenced earlier, that people are only reading 28% of your page. So overall, if the users don't need it, don't write it. Saying less often communicates so much more. So the example I like to think about is the US legal system, because it can be a little bit silly sometimes. We warn about absolutely everything and any possible risk you can have with a product. What's really challenging about that is who's going to read through all of those risks and actually learn the ones that are important. I know for a fact people don't, because I've seen all of those YouTube videos of Instapots exploding in kitchens, because there was probably a whole bunch of warnings where you're like, of course I wouldn't do that. And you missed the ones that were actually about the pressure and opening the lid. Another big pet peeve of mine is I love looking up recipes online. There's like a whole blog beforehand where someone tells their life story, what they were thinking in the shower when they came up with this kitchen recipe. I just want the recipe and I have to go all the way down to the bottom to get that. Don't do that to your end users and your colleagues who are reading your news, because they're not necessarily going to have that same drive and incentive to get all the way to the end of your news article. Now, oh, sorry, that's Hugo.
That's fine. I'm so glad that my blog is down right now. You have no idea. Um, so front loading all elements on your page is actually important. And I always compare front loading to, if you've ever watched a James Bond movie, right? There's like explosions and car chases and things like that. And then they get to the credits. Well, the introduction, the title sequence, and then they set the tone of the information that you need to be able to for the story to move forward. Same idea applies here, maybe with less explosions. And so, the first thing that we want to do is understand that, you know, people, as Emily said, statistically will read usually the first two paragraphs. So make the first two paragraphs the most important paragraphs there are. And if people only read that, they should have all the information they need. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about is we'll talk about information sent later, but making people understand that, hey, if I need to dig a bit deeper, I can dig deeper further in the article. But again, remember, our goal is to communicate, is to convey a message that results in a change of behavior. So if I focus on the first two sentences, first two paragraphs on giving you all the information you need, great. If you need more, dig deeper. Now, even worse, we want to make sure that people look at so on the next slide, right? We want to make sure that we use headings. And Emily talked about headings, and this session is about being creating inclusive news. So we also understand that headings help people with accessibility issues, right, with screen readers and understand the structure of content. But also, we need to think about people with cognitive issues who might need more contextual information about what's happening, right? So write it for everyone, use headings and ways that people can scan so they can get the information that is relevant to them, whether they are using a screen reader or whether they're just able-bodied and are fully, reading the text itself. Now, when you write your headings, one thing that's important to understand is people, in average, will read the first two words of your heading. In fact, in average, they'll read the first 11 characters. So if you're one of those organizations that says, Contoso Inc., blah, 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 Contoso Inc., blah, 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 in all your news and your headings and things like that, guess what? All people see is exactly what I just said. Contoso Inc., blah, 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 right? So switch things around and put the most important words in the first two words of that heading. And then if you want to say that it's about Contoso Inc., you can do that later. And we'll give you some real examples of how to do that very shortly. Um, and Emily's talked about it, but we want to make sure that we want to remove the content that's already been provided on the sites, and then consider adding a summary, like a TLDR at the top of the page, right? Where we're able to actually make sure that everyone is getting the content they're looking for. Now, uh, this is me, right? Yeah, this is Emily. Emily, why don't you take that one?
All right. So one of the things you can do when you're adding the summary to support that scanning, we've been already adding these headers and using the header styles. Guess what? They come with anchor links, which is awesome. So what I recommend is changing this first section to a 1/3 right, pasting in that, adding in that text web part, call it your table of contents, list out all of your different headings, make sure you use that heading 2 style for your table of contents. And then you can only grab these anchor links when you are in the publish mode. You unfortunately can't get them in edit mode. So you might want to open another tab and do it side by side. But here I just grabbed one of those anchor links, hit Control K, add it to that part of your table of contents. And then when you publish it and click on it, you'll see it'll jump you down automatically to that part on the page. Now, clicking hyperlink text remains the most used feature on the internet. So if you are adding in this summary, that's actually going to promote people scanning down your page and getting that information. I can't believe that we are already 1 hour in and only have 30 minutes left. So we're going to go a little bit faster through our remaining content.
And speaking of going faster, right? When we are online, we actually tend to read 25% slower. So if we look at kind of what we need to do to make things better, well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to make content easier to scan, which is our next slide. And if only we had an expert in usability who could talk to us about how we can make content easier to scan. Emily?
So during this whole presentation, you've probably been scanning these slides as we talk. And as you're looking at this slide right now, what elements draw your eyes first? Probably the words stand out or attract attention. They're a different color and they're bold. So visual hierarchy is this pattern in the visual field where some elements stand out or attract attention more strongly than the other elements. So one of the things that you can do on your page is use section backgrounds to highlight that important content. So we're going to go back into our Disney reopening article. We already used a light section background for overview to give it that visual separation. But what people really care about are the steps to visit Disneyland. So we're going to go in, edit the section, and use the absolute darkest background. So it has the heaviest visual hierarchy on the page. So now we can see when we're scanning, this is where my eyes are automatically going, even more so than that picture with all of the balloons. Now, when you are working with themes and section backgrounds, you really want to consider accessibility. I don't know about you, but I can't read any of this. White text on a yellow background is absolutely horrendous. So it's not supporting people who have different visual challenges being able to read this content. I have great visibility and I can't even read it. So, how do you know what themes and what section backgrounds are actually going to be accessible? Great news. Microsoft has a tool for that too. So if you use the Fluent UI theme designer, here you can see up in the top left, I put in the hex code for this yellow background. Across the top, you can see in context exactly how this yellow is going to appear. Horrendous. And then below it, we see a big red bar that says our color palette has an accessibility error. The minimum contrast ratio we want is 4.5. And we can see the non-accessible pair, which is this primary color on a background color, which is what we just experienced, is 1.07. That's incredibly far from 4.5. So please, please, please be really aware of these and make sure you check. One warning, all of the Microsoft themes, unfortunately, aren't accessible. So this is something that you want to double check. Now, here zoomed out is on the left our news article at the beginning of this session, what it looked like with no edits. And then on the right, we have our overview, we have our headers, we have our section background. And then we also went through, and you can tell we skinnied up a lot of the text. We made it a lot more concise, removed a lot of the redundancy. So it's a lot easier to consume. More likely that someone's going to read this page on the right than the one on the left. Here is a zoom in on that section background. Now, the other thing that can add to your visual hierarchy is not just colors, but it can also be headings, subheadings, underlined links. So here we can see we have these bold titles, we have numbers and the pound sign calling out those numbers. So symbols draw your attention, and then we have those underlined hyperlinks. So this is actually supporting our ability to scan here too. But we can make it a little bit better than this. If you notice, those headers actually match the titles of what our hyperlinks are. So we're seeing the same thing twice. Why not just make your headers a hyperlink? So since hyperlinks are the number one thing that's clicked on a page, you don't need that redundancy of a header and a hyperlink. You can reduce that into just one step. And make sure that when you're using numbered lists, that it's actually things that are sequential. If it's not things that are sequential, use a bulleted list. Now, how do we write a good header?
Well, this is actually something we need to understand is that the headers and the headlines are the things that hook the reader's attention, right? And so one of the things that we want to make sure is that we're always accurate, right? We want to make sure that the headlines entice the readers, but it shouldn't oversell or distort what the story is about. And you always want to stay true to the spirit and the meaning of the articles. And I know, on the internet we have a tendency to have clickbait, trying to get people to, you won't believe what happened next. Please don't do that, right? Not within the organization, at least. You want to keep it short, right? It might seem obvious, but the headlines by nature are short. But when space limitation are consideration, like for on a blog or on news, then writers sometimes they get verbose, and I know I certainly do that all the time. So shorter is better. And one of the things that we want to make sure is use the active voice, right? And the active voice is, subject, verb, object, form, like that formula for news writing, right? The passive voice, and that's a joke because that's the opposite of what you should be doing, but the passive voice is used by many people. Don't do that, right? Write it in the most direct, the most active voice possible, because that's going to encourage people to read it. Write in the present tense as well. Even if the story happened in the past, this is something the trick, newspaper trick that we don't notice, but even things that happened in the past, they're written in the present tense because that will actually get more interaction. And avoid bad breaks. Because, well, I'm trying to remember what this was. Oh, yes. This was one of my favorite recently that happened. If you read this heading, probably not the best way to break the sentence, right? I'm not going to read it because, it's a family show. But so we want to make sure that we pay attention to how we write things, and we'll talk about that later. Now, we also want to make sure that we make the headline appropriate to the story, and this is one of my favorite headline that is probably not appropriate to the story. And just before anybody gets offended, this is actually the chick is the name of the person who's accusing some of her male colleagues of sexism, right? But it comes across as probably the worst headline possible. So think about that, right? Think about maybe you could have rephrased this a little bit better. All right. And the other thing too is know where to capitalize. So lots of people will have a tendency to try to capitalize with like the first letter of every word. Little trick here again, because we know how people read, just capitalize the first word of the headline and any proper nouns. Don't capitalize every word unless that's the style of your particular publication within the organization. But please try to avoid doing that. What else do we have? We've got our headlines here, right? So our headlines, when we look at how people read, again, uh, they look at the headlines and then they go from the headline to the lead. So let's talk about what the headlines are and what the leads are. So the let's next, yeah, the lead is, so if the headline is about capturing people's attention and getting hooked, the lead is about the thing that convinces them to click through. And so how do we convince them? In the lead, you should probably tell them what happened or what could happen, who did it, right? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? If you're able to answer as many of those questions as possible in the lead, you're actually, and amazingly enough, like you're going to get people hooked more. And I know it might sound counterintuitive because you might say, well, if I'm giving people all the information that they need in the lead, they're not going to click through. Remember, again, our goal is to convince or to convey a message that results in a change in behavior. And if you've given people all the information they need without having to click through, that's okay. But I guarantee you that if you're giving them all the information they need, they will also be more compelled to click through because if it's a message that's important to them, they will actually want to read more. And please don't repeat the first paragraph like in the lead. This is the lazy man's solution to, I'm just going to copy the first paragraph. That's probably the worst way to get people engaged, because when they go and click through, they'll actually like, oh, I've read this before, and you've lost a huge opportunity to actually, because again, remember, people read the first two paragraphs. So if you can convey a different set of information in the lead that gives me everything I need, and in the first two paragraphs, I'm giving you the most important content, you've actually more than likely convinced people to change their behavior. But there's other ways that we can get people to look through. Emily?
So now that we've talked about our headline and our lead, we're now in the body of our message. We're going to talk a little bit about this concept, the law of common regions. So it's this idea that items within a boundary are perceived as a group and assumed to share some common characteristics or functionality. We can create these common regions using that section background that you saw me use, spacing, borders, and how you group information. So if we are trying to get that change in behavior and we have an action that we want somebody to take after reading our information, we can embed that action next to the information about why it's important, hopefully convincing them to take that next step. So let's take a peek at our news article here. We want them to follow these Disneyland resort rules. So we talk on the left about following the rules. On the right, we're going to use a call to action Webpart. And we're going to put in the title of that information of what it is and a call to action on the button. So again, there's this idea, since they're in one section and we're giving these related elements a frame to show they belong together, we are giving someone that action, that next step to take immediately. You can also use different backgrounds on your call to action web parts to give them some more information. So when you are using these call to action web parts, use the rules of the different header styles and also think about front loading those elements and providing that action word to convince someone to actually click and follow through on that information.
So you want to be careful also how you use images in your content. And let's actually go to the next slide to really illustrate what we're talking about here. Probably that's the worst example to use, right? So please don't take this as best practices. This is an example of a real website that you probably should, like, if your site looks like this, then let's talk. But let's look at maybe some other examples of using images the right way. So the first thing that we need to understand is, yes, we have decorative images and they make pages look pretty, but they also tend to push the information down the page. They have value, right? But because they can support the brand, they can help the tone of voice, right? But you have to be careful not to overdo it to the point where people don't get the content. Information carrying images However, they convey information, and that's kind of why they're called like that. But like a product image for a product that you sell, or a person's photo to add, this is the person we're talking about. Those are information carrying things. And again, we've looked at the heat maps and how people look. People have a tendency to look at those images a lot longer. In fact, people tend to track um, people tend to track generic images like banner ads and things like that, and they ignore them. But real images, especially people that they know, people will look at them a lot longer. So if you want people to pay attention, use your CEO's image. Use, your smiling employees, not generic employees, but your actual real employees. But again, look at this image here, right? So this is a picture of someone that Emily and I both love and respect, and who's, everyone loves in the community. But look at where he's pointing. And more than likely, when you look at this page, you actually your eyes naturally went to the corner of that page. Now, if we just flip that image around, now actually Mark is actually pointing to the heading. And I bet you that when the image switched around, you probably went and read the heading that is "Be careful in how you use images." That is super powerful. We're just trained to do that, and we do that naturally. So take advantage of that. Use your powers for good, not evil. Emily, let's talk about some other images.
So, as Hugo mentioned, it's really powerful to use images that belong to your organization. Well, we know we all have separate site collections. Images on site collections, when you add them to a page, are automatically saved in site assets. That's not really helpful to get from one site collection to another. What you can actually do is use what's called organizational assets. So, you can declare multiple libraries, document libraries, an organizational asset, and they'll appear all across your tenant under your organization when you want to add images. What's also nice about this is when you have a rebrand at your organization, or maybe a copyright for a patient image expires, you can remove them from that central spot and they'll get removed from everywhere. So it gives you a lot of control all across your environment. But when you're using your images, again, we want to keep accessibility in mind.
And so one of the ways that we can do that is to use labels, right? So when you go to your pages, you want to make sure that you do put a descriptive label of your image. And that's something that's available on any image you embed on the page. Now, please resist the temptation of describing something else, right? Make sure you're describing the page. And please don't say this is an image of, or this is a picture of. People who are using screen readers already understand that this is an image of or a picture of. So describe really what the image is about. This is usually the part where Emily and I take a little break because we want people to take a picture of this slide. These are if you're wondering the size of the images, right? This is kind of the guidelines of um, what sizes you should create your images for the best kind of rendering, depending on the page layout that you're using and your aspect ratio.
Hey, Hugo and Emily, this is Ted. I just wanted to give you the about the 10-minute warning here. The other session is going to start at 2:30 or shortly thereafter. So
Perfect.
and we still want to get.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We still want to get the survey in and and giving away a $25 gift certificate. So I'll let you finish up, but
yeah, it's almost like we rehearsed this. Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. So now let's talk about getting the results you want. Emily?
So when you're building your news, you want to focus on decreasing your interaction cost. Just like animals forage for food and want to spend the least amount of calories, the people who are looking at your news want to spend the least amount of energy to find that information. And how do we do that? We provide a strong information scent. So here we have on the left a news carousel, and I'm avidly against news carousels because they don't give you that strong information scent. If you see on the right, we have it structured in the top story view, and we get so much more information. Whoops. We get the site title, we get the lead, and we also get who published it and how recent it is. So we want to make sure that we use structures of these news web parts that provide that strong information scent and really encourage clicks for people to read your news. Now, earlier, I also mentioned that we want to create a consistent user experience for news. You could do this by creating page templates. You can do this per site collection. So you can actually save a page template that you have made. You can even embed the instructions on how to use that page in it. So when someone goes to create a new news story, they have all of the information and that governance of how to build their pages right there for them to dive in when they start. Another thing that you can do is use different template options from across Microsoft 365. I don't have time to go through all of these, but page templates are only on one site collection. If you want it to cross site collections, you'll want to consider using a third-party migration tool like ShareGate, a third-party template tool like Orchestry. Out of the box, Microsoft offers the option for site templates, but it doesn't support web parts and structures in the page, so you can't use that for this use case. Instead, I strongly recommend exploring PNP provisioning templates. You do need to know a little bit of XML and PowerShell. As a non-dev, I still play with it and find it incredibly powerful. So feel free to grab me or Hugo on Twitter after this if you want to learn more about that. Now, one of our last tips, we've been talking a lot about that information sent. So how many people have seen this before? We have learn more, learn more, learn more. Not really providing value, not giving me a good information sent, not supporting my information foraging, and it's absolutely not accessible to people with screen readers who don't have the additional context of the spatial relationship of those images and titles to the links. So instead, what you want to do is you want to be more specific, avoid generic language and jargon. You want to be sincere. You have to deliver on this link promise. So for the beach, get some sun. For the city, take in culture. You also want to be substantial. These all need to be long enough to differentiate from each other, but they also need to be succinct because, as we know, people are reading 11 characters, so we don't want them to be so long that we lose our readers. Now, we talked a lot about people getting their information and acting on it, right? So to communicate is to deliver a message resulting in a change in behavior. Well, here's our Disneyland resort rules. If we want them to read those rules, embed it in the page. Don't ask them to go somewhere else. Don't ask them to take those extra steps. Lead them to that information that they need right there. Now, it's not always possible to embed information in a page. So you can do things like using that call to action web part and linking to the information elsewhere and have that open in a separate tab.
All right. And, if you're saying, hey, I'm not an expert in accessibility and I still want to make sure that my content is accessible, there's actually an extension that you can download from Microsoft for free. It's called Accessibility Insights for the web. There's actually one for the desktop as well, but we're talking about creating web news here. So do that. Go download it. It'll actually look at your content. It'll tell you, hey, this is not, the contrast is not high enough. You don't have alternate images and things like that. All right, so let's wrap this up. I would like to thank you. Right today, we talked to you about how you can use SharePoint News to actually really engage with your audience and target the content to the people where it matters to them and where they will see it. But we've also talked to you about how you can structure your content in a way that it will, and you may have heard this once or twice, but it will convince people, right? It will convey the message that results in a change in behavior, because ultimately that's what it's about. And repeating and repeating ourselves like Emily and I did today is one way that you can do that. It's okay to repeat the same message if it gets in the change in behavior you want. Thank you. Let's take a look at who's going to get that grand prize or how we get that grand prize.
It is a weighted average here. I use the random number generator, but the more that you participated in the chat, the more chance you have to win. And the winner is, imagine that, Benjamin. Participation has its benefits.
There you
Actually,
go.
Benjamin, if you'll send me your contact information in the chat, that would be great. And our treasurer will send you out that $25 gift certificate. Emily and Hugo, thank you so much. Great session as always. Everyone who was in the session there, these will be on YouTube as was mentioned. Please go out to the Minnesota 365 user group YouTube site. And while you're there, please subscribe. It helps us. It's one way for us to make sure that you're seeing all the most recent stuff. And stick around for the next session, which is Joy, Apple. And who is with Joy on the next session?
Jay Leask, I believe.
I think you're.
Yes, that's
yeah, you're
correct.
right. You're right.
Just some
Yeah.
guy can't get his act
Jay
together.
Lee.
Excellent. We're also going to be doing a moderator handoff here too. As much as I love doing this all day, I'm excited to hand it off to Kate. She'll be coming on here soon in a second. But thank you very much, Emily and Hugo. Everybody go out and fill out that survey. Please let them know feedback is always helpful. And then stick around for the end of the day for the final giveaway of the Surface Go. All right. Thanks, folks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Ted, are you able to hear me as I
I
change
am.
to the moderator? Perfect.
I am. I'll stick around here for a few minutes to get you going too.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Nice job, Hugo and Emily. As I caught the end of it, you guys were absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm surprised. No wisecrack from Hugo. That's unusual.
I was taken aback. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, the lighting is not.
Oh, there's Kate.
Hi. Okay,
How
I
are
got you the
you?
blinds. This is.
How are you? Oh. So Joy, you're here, right?
I'm
And
here.
Jay, it's been a while. I think it's been at least a couple sessions since I last moderated one of yours. Well, I'll be leaving you and leaving you in Kate's capable hands.
Okay.
But
That'll be great.
if it's anything like the past ones I've seen, I'm sure it's going to be a wonder to behold.
Thank you.
All right, Kate,
Can I
do you
just-
need anything from me? Do you want me
Can
to?
I just ask you a quick question on recording? So do you end your recording then?
I am
and then do-
stopping it right now as